name is Brenda Sendejo. I am an associate professor of feminist studies at Southwestern University currently. Going into my 12th year actually there. I'm from Corpus Christi, Texas, proud, born and raised, but have been in Austin for almost 30 years now. I am a Chicana feminist anthropologist. I have a current book in progress on Chicana spiritual activism. I've had a couple of pieces published recently on spiritual activism and also the emergence of Chicana feminism in Texas. So I look at the history of Chicana feminist thought and how one manifestation of that is spiritual activism. And I have a digital humanities project. So have some things going on here and there, but that's it in a crux.
And I'm excited to talk to you because I feel like there are a lot of things I want to know. You know, I'm familiar with your work, but a lot of things I want to know that I want to be thinking about together. We've had these really good conversations in the various episodes. We also had Anel Flores. We had Lourdes Perez. We've had some other guests, Kimberly Garza, who is an up-and-coming novelist. So we're thinking about Latinx. Originally, it was Latina writers and social justice. And then we went to Latinx, kind of opened it up. So Latinx / writers and social justice. And then I contemplated calling it Latinx studies and social justice to kind of think more broadly. Because I think writing is important, but there's so many different kinds of writing that happen in our field that are necessary parts of the way that we think and move and work. And so I'm super excited to think about those things and also various other kinds of things that may come up in our conversations. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you for having me. I'm so excited for the conversation.
I was going to wear my corpus hat and I said we can just say this is the corpus episode. So we're both from Corpitos. I'd like to start with context, right? You told us a little bit about how you identify, but I was wondering if you could tell us more about that. So how do you identify, and however you interpret that question?
Yeah, that's such a good question. So I identify as Chicana and Tejana. However, I'm open to Chicanx, Latinx, Mexican American, but I think my identities as Chicana and Tejana are what I think ground me the most right now, make me sort of feel connected to my true sense of myself. And because there were journeys connected to coming into those identities, I think that's why I hold them quite dear. I started identifying as Hispanic growing up in Corpus. And so that journey from Hispanic to Chicana has been a really interesting one. And it's one that resonates with, I think, a lot of folks, a lot of us who get into this kind of work, right? This sort of coming into a consciousness that I think was really interesting being from a place like Corpus. As you know, it's such a unique place. It's a place, I think, where you can come into certain ways of being and knowing later in life. Like, I think I really kind of came to understand myself more deeply as I got the tools in school later on in life to really get, the subtleties of racism or the subtleties of what sort of inspired my feminism, the things that happened, right? So this sort of historical memories of being Tejana in Corpus is something that I think really fuels my identity as a Chicana feminist and very much a Tejana also. Yeah.
Did your family members identify as Hispanic, or where are your parents from and how did they identify?
Yeah, so we're like 5th or 6th generation Tejano on my mother's side, and my dad's mom is from Guanajuato, but we always identified as Hispanic. There was not a Chicano, Chicana was as for many older generations, a derogatory term for my grandmother, right? So there was no sense of that word at all growing up until I got to undergrad. My last semester, I learned about the Chicana movement for the first time ever. I'd never heard that term, didn't identify with it, wasn't familiar with the Mexican American Civil Rights Movement. In Corpus, we were very connected to GI Forum, LULAC, right? Like that was kind of that history of Mexican American civil rights was very much part of a Hispanic identity, right? So that was very present with Hector Garcia, all of that history, but we were very much Hispanic and proud to be Hispanic. That was connected to, I think, a middle-class identity, right? Consciousness as well.
Yeah, I've always wondered how connected that is. Was it, influence, or were we influenced by, or was it a mutuality of, because HEB, the most popular grocery store in Texas, had a Hispanic food aisle, right? And that's what it was called, you know, so it's like that. I feel like it shaped my identity, and we shaped it. Like the, definitely, yeah, there was, you know, not a Chicano food aisle, right? Or not even Tex-Mex or not, you know.
No, it's true. Well, and right, like all of those cultural symbols of growing up, right? And the kinds of things you had access to. And what's interesting is, growing up, my mom's family is from the west side of Corpus, and grew up on Elgin Street in a little casita, 10 kids. And there were 10 of them. One of them went to college at UT, one of the youngest. And we never really had a sense of Chicanismo or the Chicano movement. But my grandmother's sister also had 10 kids. They lived a mile away, and they all ended up going to school, to university. And some of them were involved in the Chicano movement. So there's parallels, right, of different families. And the influence, I think, of higher education and that period, right? One of my second primos, Roger Barrera, was Raza Unida, went to Crystal City, was very much involved. He also went to Vietnam. He also, went to school, higher ed. So it was there. It just wasn't part of my history, my consciousness until much later.
Yeah, that's fascinating. It's like you were insulated from it, right? And that's maybe part of that so-called economic mobility, right? The being desirous of a middle class Hispanic identity that we were all acculturated to, particularly in that time and place, right? So yeah, that's super interesting that it's there, right? But I wonder if it was something that was seen as dangerous or risky, or like, do you have a sense of that now that you know about that, like what the dynamic was?
That's such a good question. I think it has to do in part with, my dad's mother was a Mexican immigrant, right? So part of the, the goal was to get as much education as you can, to get the job you can, to support the family. And so, I was raised with a consciousness about helping through the context of the church, the community, helping by, my dad was, adamant about giving back in certain kinds of ways, but they weren't connected to sort of movements for social justice as we think of them today, right? So I don't think it was anything intentional. I just think that wasn't sort of the consciousness. And again, I think, and I do my own research on thinking about, these Chicana feminists that emerged not only in a university setting, but that was really the impetus for so much of this knowledge production that happened. So I think there's a lot to be said for that as a catalyst, right? For this consciousness raising, political consciousness, feminist consciousness. And so, but I also think about, my grandmother and her movidas and her feminism at the kitchen table and raising 10 kids, and the radicalness of thinking about how you can raise 10 kids on rice, beans, tortillas, and papas, like that sort of, right? Yeah. Like that resistance, resilience, like that's some smart stuff.
Right? That is resourceful, right?
Yeah. And up against, all kinds of discrimination, but also, when I was listening to Irene Lara Silva's piece, I think what really resonates with me these days are like identifying the joy and the love and the, that part of it too, that is so rich and that isn't often, part of these histories. We think about our resistance, it's very important. It's a very important part of our history, but so is the joy and the love. And so when I think about like the little casita on Elgin Street, and I think about walking in there and, a Sunday afternoon after church and having barbacoa and pan dulce and walking in Domingo Peña's playing, I just get this like sense of like, right? Like that's home, and walking down the street and going to tiendita with our quarters, this like band of primos, and we're walking to the store to get our orange push-ups. Like, I didn't appreciate it then, but right, the ways that memory works, right, to help build our identities. Anyway, it's kind of a tangent, but it's also interconnected, right? Like the ways in which we can now appreciate the things of the past as having formed us and have, that inspires my direction today and the work I do and why I do it are those stories, right? But the meanings and the significance didn't come until later, I have to say.
Right. Like looking back now as you make sense of those kinds of experiences, that is super interesting to think about. The grandmothers, right, and the mothers, they might not necessarily have identified as feminists, but their ways of moving through the world could be regarded as such in terms of the kinds of different survival strategies that they practiced and instilled. One of the things I'm thinking about is the way that sometimes when we think about these histories, it may seem at first that you came to feminism or you came to the work that you do kind of in college, but in a lot of ways it sounds like the way that you read it, that you see it as really coming from your background, and that perhaps that informed your experiences in college, right?
I think so. I think that it's sort of, you take what is accessible to you, right? And so, I didn't know that there was a thing called Chicano studies or Mexican American studies. So but I did find anthropology somehow. I found anthropology, and luckily there were some Chicano anthropologists at UT in undergrad when I went. But I knew Latin American studies, right? So that's what my minor was, Latin American studies, until that one class I found, and with Martha Menchaca, Mexican American culture, and it blew my mind out of the water. It was that encuentro with a story that I recognized, and it resonated, and it inspired transformation within me because it connected, right? It was that thing that I was searching for, but I didn't know what to look for. I didn't know what I was looking for, but when I saw it, something happened. And so I think that, yes, I think that the stories of my family, my grandmother, those interactions, it all sort of came together, in that moment where it's like, this is a thing. I can actually study this, get degrees after the undergrad, and really be proud. There's, I think growing up in Corpus, I think one of the things with the educational system was that there were so, as there are today still, right? The silences, the erasures, all of that, right? These untold histories. But there was something about the histories of mujeres that I wanted to know more about, right? There are more histories out there that hadn't been told. And so, going into the museum field and getting introduced to Carmen Lomas Garza through that work. And then, just this sort of opening up and this flourishing of these different opportunities for engaging in something that the more I got into it, the more I started thinking about it, started aligning with who I really was, who I really am. And I just didn't have access to that before. And I think that's what Chicana studies, Chicanx studies, Chicano, studies and Chicana feminist, like Latinx studies, that's, I think, it's so abundant in possibility for connection, right? With that which we didn't have before. We didn't have access to it before. And so I think that's where, for me, spiritual activism and the idea of putting ourselves back together, right? In the words of Anzaldúa, like, we were fragmented, right? But when we can have this opportunity to put ourselves back together and see ourselves represented, it is transformative. And I think but it's not something that I think that we can be conscious of early in life all the time, right? It can come much later. It came for me in my 30s. I first read Borderlands by Anzaldúa in grad school at like 35. Now it's like as many people as I can get it, and that kind of work in their hands earlier on, the better.
Yeah, I hear you. Yeah. So I want to backtrack to a couple of things you mentioned. One is you said the church. Can you clarify what you mean by the church? What church?
Sure. Yes. So the Catholic Church, I was raised in a devoutly Catholic church, upbringing for all the sacraments. My family, as far back as we can trace, have been Catholic. The Catholic Church had a lot of influence, I think, in our lives, right? So culturally, we would go to church. We were raised with a sense of connection to a particular faith, but it wasn't as much a Mexican Catholicism as that of my grandparents, right? So with social mobility and middle class, the Virgin sort of was not as present. She wasn't as prevalent as she was in my grandmother's house on Elgin, or my other grandmother's house in Corpus. So there was a reclaiming that came with the Virgen de Guadalupe in my own Chicana feminist consciousness, because there was this sort of gap. She was there, she just wasn't as prevalent and present. But the Catholic Church was, the place that we went for community, for familia. And while it gives me comfort because it's familiar, I always questioned it. I always questioned from a very young age why women couldn't be priests, why there was, if we were correct and other faiths weren't, what would happen to my Lutheran friends, or what was, so these questions always came up for me, and I never really got answers growing up. But that's okay. I understand. I mean, the church worked. It was a survival mechanism for people, my grandparents. I mean, it was their cultural identity in the face of discrimination. So it had lots of functions. But I always questioned, and I always wanted to know more. And so the church has been something that, while I respect folks and their religion, for me personally, it has had problems that I can't quite reconcile from an institutional standpoint. My relationship to the Virgen has grown and blossomed and changed and been something really important to me, and something I've looked at in the lives of the women I work with as a feminist figure, as a versatile social justice warrior in many ways. And so to me, that's just been the most amazing thing, to see how she is the multiplicity of the Virgen de Guadalupe Tonatzin, and how she works, how she functions, right, in people's lives. So that's been part of sort of this trajectory with regards to Catholicism. And I've just learned so much more than I ever could have imagined about it and its complexities through the lives of my grandparents, and also the women that I work with, who've been involved in movements for social change.
And you also mentioned spiritual activism. Can you tell us a little bit what you mean by that?
Gloria Anzaldúa, Annalise Keating have written extensively about spiritual activism. And I think that one of the things that resonates with me as a praxis and theory, right, is that spiritual activism can be understood as the idea of garnering the inner resources to do the outer work of social change, right? That we have to have. For Anzaldúa, it was meditation, it was writing, right? So writing is a spiritual act. It was the idea that it's really difficult to do the kind of work that is often required of activists, of social justice workers, educators, even if you don't identify as an activist, but the work of fighting for justice requires inner work too. And so the idea that activism is beyond the political realm, beyond community organizing, but that it can also be connected to spiritual growth and soul work, is sort of at the crux, at the core of spiritual activism. So when I started doing my dissertation research on Chicanas active in the Tejano civil rights movement, and they would tell us stories, spirituality came in, and it came in a way that I wasn't familiar with Catholicism. It came in a way of questioning, of reclaiming different goddesses and deities, of thinking about feminism and inclusion in really radical ways that more aligned with sort of my soul and my gut feeling of looking at justice and inequality, that we can think about different possibilities for liberation if we bring in looking at activism on a mind, body, spirit level, right? So that it's connected. It's not that this intellectual work is separate from what's happening with the spirit or the soul for a lot of folks in my research. So it just really opened up sort of the potential for thinking about liberation, right? And thinking about, so the material realities of being folks of color, women, queer folks, what it means to live in the borderlands, the many different borderlands, and what it requires of us to do that, right? And what kind of work we need to do internally in order to do that work. And so I think one of the beautiful things, I've been really lucky, is to be able to interact with these veteranas, the primeras, las grandes as they're called, these women like Marta Cotera, Maria Elena Martinez, Norma Cantu, is, the kinds of justice and the kinds of feminism they employ is healing. It's the work of let's help people put themselves back together. And it's in these movidas, these smaller movements that are, they can be about, for example, when Norma was writing the introduction to the 25th anniversary of Borderlands, I remember opening up and reading it, and I saw my name in there, and I just about fell on the floor. And she was just listing, people who were doing work and employing us all do as work. And I thought, and she mentioned myself in spiritual activism. And I just, to this day, that sticks with me, like the ultimate movida, because that helped me put myself back. I mean, that is the kind of thing. She may not think it's that big of a deal, but it's huge when you think about the struggle, in graduate school and all these different things. So it's these sort of smaller things, or checking in every so often, how's it going in the institution? How's it going in academia, right? And navigating these different institutions, just checking in on you, right? And also encouraging us to pay it forward, right, to future generations. So I think the work of the intergenerational knowledge production and exchange with regards to feminism, to me, that has been the most fulfilling work, to see the veteranas with our students, yourself and your own work, right? Like seeing the students see your work and opening up and saying, someone sees me as my full self. I don't have to show up fragmented. Dr. Cuevas's work shows me that. Dr. Cantu's work shows me that. All these other people that are doing this work that is healing work, that is work that is, it's monumental in many ways. It's important. And I think when we think of social justice, to me, that's part of the work that fulfills me and makes me feel like that's kind of my life's work, is to help bring people together so they can have those sorts of encuentros that I remember just changed my life earlier on. And I can see the potential in my own students, whether it's an archive. So talking about writing, right? So whether it's inviting students to write their own story and saying your story is important. You write your story. It is important. To telling your story, to interviewing people and asking them their stories, to having stories emerge out of the encuentros with other people and knowledge. I think it's just, there's so many possibilities and potential that it's been super interesting just to see that emerge over the years.
And there are multiple levels happening I see in what you're saying, where you're thinking about the kinds of praxis that are the knowledge. When you think about knowledge production, it's the processes too, right? Mm-hmm. Not just the kinds of publications that folks might put out, but the kinds of practices in the community building, those kinds of community formations that they engage in, that they model, moving through spirit of generosity, blurring the lines between, community and academy, and putting the academy in service of the community and things like that. Yeah, I see, folks like that you've mentioned, kind of, trying to break down those barriers and create spaces for the next generation, and to demand that those of us coming up kind of do the same, and that we, learn from their model of the paying it forward, as you said. Yeah, it's a really beautiful way of moving through the world, not just about, knowledge production in a really kind of narrow capitalist corporate academic sense.
That's right.
But about mutuality and sharing and solidarity and exchange and co-supporting each other. Right?
Yeah, I mean, the ultimate sort of feminist act, right, is collaboration and generosity of spirit. I use that all the time to describe the women that I've been able to work with, because there is this sense of, it's not holding on to something as my own. It's not this, like you said, capitalist sort of knowledge production in order to move forward and to get different kinds of accolades. It doesn't mean that we're not part of that system, because I think, we are in academia, but there are possibilities and potential for doing it differently. And I didn't know that before I came into contact with certain kinds of scholar activists who are looking at sort of the bigger picture, looking at justice and looking at that within the context, yes, of institutions and academia, but also pushing the boundaries, like you said. In the piece I wrote for Chicana Movidas, Marta Cotera talks about the space in between. And it was this space of developing, the Chicana Research and Learning Center in the university setting, but also in the community. And to me, that is the ultimate model, right? I mean, that's how Chicano studies emerged, right? But I think we can get back to that in so many ways that are so interesting and exciting, by which a lot of folks are doing, connecting with community, asking them for feedback, and doing it in a way that values their perspectives and people's perspectives just as much as the institution. And it's not that it's it's easier said than done, I'm sure, in many ways. But if that can be one of the things that we aim towards, right, and trying to create more inclusive spaces and finding that space in between, right? So perhaps it's not just about an institution, but that, different kinds of work that's happening in the community is upheld as sort of, I think, a model that then the university follows, right? So is there a way to think about, like, for instance, the Chicana Research and Learning Center, the kinds of work, I mean, just to give an example, I didn't know this. I mean, the archive revealed all of this. There was work happening in the 70s through the research center that involved Martha Cotera and Evie Chapa going, particularly Martha Cotera, going, 100 visits a month to Girl Scouts, to churches, to elementary schools, right? To being, invited to Colorado, to women's centers, and doing assertiveness training for mujeres in Central Austin. It was just this huge array of efforts, little by little, just sort of, sharing the knowledge, sharing the histories, and it mattered. But that whole history of that has not been upheld, right? And part of that has to do with some of the structural limitations that folks like Martha, Ana Neto Gomez of their generation faced, and not getting access to PhDs the way that we have as much, right? So their knowledge is not perhaps sort of valued the same way, right? Their histories, but this work is work that has to be brought into the limelight, and it's work that has to be acknowledged as helping us build Chicano studies. I mean, it's at the core of why I can sit here having this conversation with you. And I think that we have to understand those important historical genealogies, because it's a feminist act to do that. It's in itself, I think, social justice work.
I think that's really important, right? Citing those folks, naming them here, honoring their work is also a form of that kind of justice, getting their story out there, right? What you're doing in your work, right? Through your various kinds of things. So that's one of the questions I want to ask you about, kind of just think about work. And work is kind of a weird word. And so interpret it as you will, right? This may be a complicated question. Maybe your answer is shifts over time, perhaps, as it should. What do you see as your work in the world?
I've thought about this question a lot. I think, as I mentioned before, one of the things that I've been privileged to do, and that I think is really powerful, is to use my position to bring together multiple generations to share knowledge. I think that is the work that I want to do. I love teaching, but what I really love about teaching is bringing students together with folks within and outside of academia, activists, organizers, because it's one thing, the text is important, of course, but that I'm really obsessed with the idea of encuentro right now, the idea of plática, like these notions, Maria Cotera, Dolores Delgado Bernal, like all of these folks who are doing these methodologies that I think are really related to spiritual activism. Like, I think these certain kinds of methodologies and pedagogies, they do something for folks. And I'm really interested, because it was my own experience. The minute I met Maria Elena Martinez, my whole life changed, and it changed in ways that have been so fulfilling. And it doesn't mean that it's going to maybe happen for a student in a class in a way that's going to have them pursue a PhD in, the anthropology or anything necessarily, Chicana feminisms, but maybe. But I think it could be multiple things. I think it could just that consciousness, maybe you take that into your profession as a teacher and, K through 12, maybe you take it into your position as, in politics or law, whatever it is. I just think that consciousness, that ability to say, you know what, I've been seen, my story matters, and I'm going to help people to know that their story matters. So to me, it's this notion of like facilitating inclusion. And I think that I can see certain things from my positionalities, and being at an institution where there are very few folks who are Latinx faculty and no other Chicana feminist faculty who do work in this field, I think it's really helped me to see how much work there is to be done. So when you're in a space where, they're just a handful, maybe 4 Chicano studies classes, Chicano feminist classes, and you see the potential for students just having their mind blown by the decolonizing knowledge and considering different ways of thinking and being in the world and navigating. And then they come back and they help build on all of that because they're tools that they're learning in the context of a predominantly white space. Like all of that is so interesting to me. And it's so, what's the word? It's just very generative, right? And to me, that's really at the crux of sort of Chicanx, Latinx studies and feminism, right? Is this notion that we're building and creating new things that will in turn, help us make our way in the world. And but it's continual. It's not necessarily something that's static. And that's what I love about it. So learning from students too, and hearing the kinds of things, students pushing back too and saying, we could do a little better with this. We could move forward with this. We could consider these different ways of understanding gender and disability at the intersections of race and class. So they're continuing, right, to kind of build as well. And so I think the generative nature of that is so inspiring. And so I think, I look at it as spiritual activism in some ways because I just think there's so much potential and need for thinking about, putting ourselves back together and self-love. I mean, thinking about Audre Lorde, right? And thinking about self-care. I mean, it really is quite radical and in my view, extremely necessary. And it's a journey. I think it's a journey, but I think if we can really attend to the legacy that we already have in place of our abuelas and our tias and our madres and other folks as well, right? And then put that together with the other kinds of knowledge that we're getting from our fictive kin, right? Or our feminist madres, our ancestors that maybe are not blood related, right? Like putting all that together and creating something, I think is what excites me. And doing that with archives and doing that with interviews and encuentros and in the context of the classroom and creating zines and, all of this potential, I think it's my work. I like it. So that's sort of where I'm, that's the idea now at 50 anyway. I don't know, it can change when I turn 60, but I'm having fun with it in many ways. And I'm learning so much from my students. That in and of itself has been quite a gift, is to, their generosity of spirit saying like, Dr. Sendejo, let's maybe think about this a little bit. And it's sort of, and we go back and forth, right? So it's this sort of relationship. It's very relational, and it's very sort of like, if we're open to it, I think if we can create those spaces, these movidas, right? We are people who create, we are people who are resilient, and we know how to do that. And if we can just create more spaces like that in academia, I think that's the next step, honestly. I think inside and outside, as I think about my journey moving forward, I want to be in a place where there is more potential and possibility for that, because that's what excites me. And that's what drives me to want to do the work that I hope is work that matters, in the words of Untitled Chapter.
And of course, I'm so inspired by you and your work definitely matters. And I know has an impact on people and is already influencing the next generations. I feel like there's a lot to think about. And I feel like your answer just now was a gift to me and a lot of folks who will hear this, to think about the beautiful ways to be self-reflective and to create meaningful spaces and to reshape academia so that it is a place where people can, co-create community knowledge and share knowledge, construct knowledge with the next generations. Awesome. Thank you so much. Thinking about when you say like work that matters, one of the things that Anzaldúa, included autoethnography like in her work, right? And it's something that definitely is a strong feminist practice. Perhaps, particularly in women of color spaces, Chicana feminist spaces, Black feminist spaces. So what role does autoethnography play, if any, in your own work?
I think it's changed over time. So when I teach my anthropology methods course, when I did that and I would teach autoethnography, as a method, I think that I was drawn to it earlier on because my story, as we're taught to think about autoethnography in the academic sense, my story gave me deeper insights into the lives I was looking at with the women that I was working with, right? So that's the idea. It helps to open up how we understand what we're seeing and what we're researching. So I think earlier on, when I first started the work, I used autoethnography as a way to, as an entry point to understand the women's experiences. So their questioning of Catholicism, I can understand that more deeply. I experienced trauma and loss in the middle of my field work during graduate school. And so I now understand autoethnography much deeper because I hadn't experienced loss the way they talked about loss in their lives until that happened. And that opened up for me a different way of understanding healing, love, family, friends, so much more deeply. So for me, at the crux of thinking of autoethnography, it really is that sort of experiential knowledge, right? That's embodied, right? So that kind of feeling of loss, deep grieving and grief inspired how not that I could, definitely connect with all of the stories of the women I work with, but there's a deeper connection once you experience something like that. And I think for me, that's why autoethnography can be so powerful. The other thing, not to get off on a tangent, but I want to say about autoethnography is that as a method, when you're using it in a way to connect, like in the interview sense, is I don't think about my interactions anymore with the mujeres that I work with as an interview, because I have challenges now with that sort of setup. So I've evolved in my thinking about it. But at the time, I was thinking of it as an interview, but really was a plática. It was an exchange. It was dialogic. But just that idea of sharing a similar story and the connection, I call it methodology of the spirit, right? That connection with another person where you have a shared understanding of one another, right? You come into a different understanding of yourself and of them. And that allowed me to write, and allows me to write in the book that I'm working on this topic of spiritual activism in a deeper sense, from a different place, right? So the writing, as I discover and I'm writing and all that inquiry that happens as you write, I'm also discovering self. I'm also opening up more of who I am and understanding myself through this interchange encuentro with the women, and even if it's a memory of an exchange with them. So I think it's a big answer, and it's probably a very complicated web, but there's so much, I think, going on when you're thinking about knowledge and self-discovery that emerges even if you don't intend for it to happen. But I think that is a possibility for autoethnography. I think I've always thought of Ansaldúa as an ethnographer of the borderlands, because and we should use her more in anthropology, because she gives us this take on the borderlands that is monumental. I mean, it's so layered and it's so deeply connects. I mean, when my students from the Valley read Ansaldúa, they just like put it down and they're like, no, but I have to walk away for a minute. This is so deep, and no one is, usually they don't learn about her in the Valley. Many of them learn about when they leave, right? The complexities of all that. There's so much there. So I think autoethnography has a potential to do those things and to open up how we understand that which autoethnography helps us to more deeply understand that which we're researching. However, now I think of autoethnography again, not just as a method. It's a methodology. It's a way of sort of seeing and viewing and entering a relationship that I don't want to call research anymore. I really hate that word now as I continue, and I am critical of anthropology and all of, and the colonialist legacies and all of that. So I think the work is also decolonizing all of that and being very critical of even that word, decolonizing, right? Like, to be careful about even using that word, but that I think that's where our generation, I feel like we're so fortunate that we can be in an in-between space where we have the elders and the veteranas and the learners and the knowers and the teachers, and our students who are that too, that are teachers and learners and knowers, and our own children, I think, in many ways, right? Like these beings that surround us, and we can take and grow and learn and kind of create. I have to say I'm sort of drawn more to notions of plática, that we, vamos a platicar, as we're doing right now, that there's knowledge that emerges in the exchanges that we have with other people that can be transformative. But I think that the idea of, testimonio, personal narrative, autoethnography, I think it has a lot of potential, and that it's growing. I think they're growing. And as we move forward in, the field, and as we bring more, folks into the field, we're just going to see it just take off. I think there's so much potential and possibility, and it's super exciting to me.
You said the book that you're working on. Will you tell us more about that, please?
The working title is, the first part is based on a quote by San Antonio activist Rosie Castro. It's called The Face of God Has Changed, Chicana Feminism and Spiritual Activism in Texas. And so it is an ethnography of a group of Tejanas, including Norma Cantu, Martha Cotera, Maria Elena Martinez, Inés Hernandez Avila, Carmen López Garza, Santa Barraza, and others. And it is a look at their spiritual activism. So over the years, I have conducted interviews, done participant observation, engaged in lots of pláticas and ceremonia, cafecitos over their kitchen tables, long distance phone calls, and helping to tell a story of spiritual activism in Texas, which I think, one of the things that I think is happening is that, kind of as I've been talking about, what we are offered, what we're gifted, I think, from that generation is the possibility and potential for new forms of thinking of liberation, as I mentioned before, and that activism is holistic, that activism can be much more than political activism, even much more than community organizing, right? I think Susana Almanza, who I also work with in this, who is the director of Poder, People Organized for the Defense of Earth and Her Resources, environmental justice organization in Austin. They've done some very, very important work in our city for decades. She is a spiritual activist in the sense of bringing spirituality to her work, to her social justice work, and that can't be separated. And when you do that, you bring more people in. You bring more people in, and you would attend to, the kinds of hurt that the earth has experienced, and that's reflected in our bodies as marginalized people, right? As folks who have been denied resources, right? So this holistic way of thinking about, activism through the lens of spirituality, I think just really extends it and expands it in terms of how we can see activism and the material circumstances and realities that are reflected in that activism. So I think as we, move forward, I had no idea. I was hoping to get the book done soon, but then COVID and the political landscape, so much has happened to us in the last 5 years. There could be 5 more books written about the potential and possibility for thinking about activism. One example from the book is looking at the Virgen de Guadalupe not seen. And I argue that if we look at the relationships of the women in this case to the Virgen, we can more deeply understand their lived experiences at the intersection of gender, sexuality, race, class, ethnicity, sexual orientation. And I think that is something that could be really, really helpful again in helping, younger generations to say, you're not alone. This is not, what you're feeling is something that people have been feeling for a long time, but we were often silenced. And also these stories, we weren't allowed to come out. We weren't allowed to question Catholicism. And these women definitely weren't, right? So I want you to see their stories so you can know, you aren't alone. And this legacy is a really rich, deep legacy. If we think about, Maria Elena, the Virgen is a healer for her. Martha Cotera, who tragically lost her son, she is a healing mother for her and a radical, subversive mother to her. For a Chicana feminist nun who is in, a sister who is in the book, I equated growing up a religious sister as someone, as asexual. I really did. I just didn't know any better. And I didn't know any women religious growing up other than the nuns we would just see from afar in church. But this particular person, Sister Teresita, talks about the Virgen is helping us to love our bodies in every way, shape, or form that our bodies and the feelings that we have. And, this person talks about Sandra Cisneros' Guadalupe, the sex goddess, and how, we can radically love and redeem ourselves through the Virgen. So through all of these stories, you can see the multiplicity and the complexities of which people are navigating, coming into this, again, this sort of wholeness, right? Back to their true selves, not one that is fragmented. And in one of the chapters, I talk about how so many of them do it through the Virgen de Guadalupe, whether she's the Virgen Guadalupe not seen, but she was a constant throughout all of these stories. And so her power and potential, because I think as a symbol, right, there is a power for transformation. And I've had my own experience with connecting with her as a way to reconnect through a kind of academia that I want to see, that I want to see as the future of inclusion. In a nutshell, a few of the things I'm thinking about.
Awesome. I'm so excited about this book. This is fabulous. It's such important histories. And I really appreciate how you're thinking about them and synthesizing for them, interpreting them in a way that helps us see the complexity of what these mujeres have brought into the world and help create in the world, and what they continue to do. A lot, the folks you're mentioning, some of them I'm aware of, and they're just such forces in the world, and have had such tremendous influence on so many people. I look forward to reading more and learning more from you and your work, to see their stories getting out there in the world, and appreciate learning from you today.
I had just a couple of paragraphs from the opening of Chicana Movida's piece. I thought that I would share this just because I think that it attends to a lot of the things I've been talking about. So with regards to what brought me to this work of interest in, the emergence of Chicana feminism and how spiritual activism is one of the manifestations of that. And also, just to give homage to women like Martha Cotera, Evie Chapa, who helped to found the Chicana Research and Learning Center. So the piece is called The Space in Between, Exploring the Development of Chicana Feminist Thought in Central Texas. So yeah, just a couple of paragraphs. A number of years ago, my path intersected with that of a Chicana spiritual activist. This chance encounter impacted me so profoundly that it came to inspire my current life's work. The journey from then to now has fulfilled me immensely, and along the way I've met numerous Chicana activists and intellectuals who shared their lives, wisdom, and knowledge with me so that I could more deeply understand the complex and dynamic relations between spirituality, gender, race, and feminism. These feministas and their unwavering commitments to justice facilitated my own feminist development, broadened my scholarly knowledge, and shaped my teaching of Chicana feminisms. Furthermore, it deepened my own understandings of my South Texas upbringing. So in this essay, I explore such Chicana feminist conocimientos, the production and transmission of knowledge that is put into practice in the service of justice, by way of a pivotal enterprise in the development of Chicana feminist thought and Chicana studies, the Chicana Research and Learning Center in Austin. I was introduced to the CLRC by its co-founder, feminist, intellectual, and activist Martha P. Cotera, who played a pivotal role in creating Chicana studies. I conducted oral histories with Cotera and poured over materials from the CLRC and Cotera archives in my quest to study the center. Much to my surprise, over the course of my research, I learned that Cotera's work with the CLRC, CRLC, and that of other mujeres actually set the stage for me to enter the field of Chicana studies and to teach a course on Chicanas at UT Austin during graduate school. A serendipitous discovery in the archives involving the course, Cotera and Gloria Ansaldúa would provide a glimpse into a genealogy of Chicana knowledge and research that was previously unknown to me. What I found revealed an interconnected web of historical moments and feminist moves involving the exchange of knowledge passed on through generations of Chicanas that is generative and fluid and persists today, as evidenced in the making of this very essay and anthology. So it's been such an honor to be a part of the anthology, because I don't think folks realize oftentimes when such pieces are made that it's not just about putting your work out there, but you're putting your work out there with other scholars and writers. You're part of a collective. And so traveling to conferences and speaking next to Martha Cotera and Nieto Gomez and Esther Hernandez and, Maylie Blackwell, all of, and Maria Cortera, like there's a real communion of feminista praxis and generosity that happens in these interchanges and exchanges. So I think just being part of something like that has also been, for me, extremely fulfilling as well.
Chicana Movidas, New Narratives of Activism and
Feminism. in the movement era, edited by Maylie, Blackwell, Maria Cortera, and Diana Espinosa. And it came out in 2018 by UT Press. And there are an amazing array of, including an interview by Maylie with Lorenz Aldua, Esther Hernandez work, again, multiple generations, looking at the cultural arts, looking at literature, looking at lots of different kinds of ways that movidas, right, these smaller moves within the context and outside of the context of social justice, and how they've happened in hallways. And my piece is in a section called Homemaking Movidas, the idea that within and outside of larger movements, we are creating home. We are making and creating these spaces where people can thrive and feel whole and resilient. And so the CLRC that I wrote about is one of those places. But yes, so Chicana Movidas is the name of it. And the concept of movidas is applicable in so many ways. And our students I taught Chicana feminisms for the first time this past year at Southwestern. And we created a zine, a Movida zine. And it's called Movidas Poderosas. And the students contributed their own movidas and talked about and thought about movidas in the context of the zines. So it's really applicable, and there's so much that can be done with the theory and method of movidas.
It's a phenomenal collection. So many heavy hitters, stars, and new folks, and just amazing histories documented and stories in that collection. Thank you for sharing that. I really like how you talk about the work that these mujeres are doing in the world as, is said, generative and fluid and persistent, still persisting today. Nicely said. So true. I look forward to seeing your individual book come out too, with your work and getting that out into the world. That's very exciting.
Thank you very much. Well, thanks for the opportunity to talk about it. I really appreciate the questions and the opportunity to reflect on it. It gets me excited to get into the writing, to get it written, to get it done. It's a work it's my soul work. It's my spiritual activist work, I hope. I really appreciate the opportunity to talk with you about it. You've been an inspiration for my work too, with your own journey and your own work. And again, really expanding how we think of borders and borderlands and the stakes too, Dr. Cuevas, right? I mean, you write about seeing each other and really seeing each other and understanding each other. The stakes are very high when we think about difference, right? Humanity, that this isn't just about writing. It's about writing and bringing stories to bear that have effects on people's lives and can be life or death situations. And so I think your work has really been so important for helping so many of us to understand the stakes and that these stories do something powerful, important, healing, and vital.
Thank you. I appreciate that. Back at you, Dr. Sendejo.
In 2013, through the assistance of a Summerlee Foundation grant, I developed with Dr. Allison Kafer the Latina History Project, and it is a digital humanities project that documents Chicana, Latina, feminism, and activism in Central Texas since the movement era. And I'm currently working with Corinne Ramirez and Angel Cantu, student researchers, to bring in more interviews, pláticas, encuentros, archives to help document that history. So we're very excited about it. We will add interviews with Susana Almanza and Liliana Wilson, Chilean artist Liliana Wilson, here very shortly. We hope that the project will be a resource that's accessible beyond higher education, so that hopefully we can get these interviews, these resources into the hands of high school, middle school students, because I think that's also the work, the important work, when we think about the efforts being done around ethnic studies, in K through 12. I hope that something like this can also help in that way, maybe even function as a space in between, in the words of Martha Cotera. So yeah, Latina History Project, Southwestern. They changed the address just recently.
Oh,
so
good.
It's Latina History Project at southwestern.edu.
And look up Dr. Brenda Sendejo and you'll find it. Thank you so much. I really appreciate your time and energy and knowledge and your you-ness.
Thank you. Right back at you. I really enjoyed it. Thank you very much for this chance and opportunity.